Good afternoon, everybody. It's great that you were able to join us for this launch of a very important document for us at the Wilson Center titled The Mosaic Approach, which focuses on the critical mineral supply chain challenges facing the United States of America, an issue which has been top of mind for a lot of policymakers, as well as many of us who study the world of public policy here in the United States. We're very, very lucky to have three extraordinary speakers with us today. Let me give a brief introduction to each of them in the order in which they will speak. First of all, we're delighted to have with us Peter Harrell, who is the Senior Director for International Economics and Competitiveness at the National Security Council with the White House. A brief bio for Peter, a former adjunct senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security and a leading expert on US economic statecraft, including sanctions, export controls, trade policy, and other geoeconomic tools. He has published widely on topics, including the use of economic coercion in the US-China relationship, US sanctions on Russia, Iran, and other countries, and the legal foundations of US sanctions. He's testified in front of Congress, and his articles and op-eds have appeared in publications including the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and many other leading outlets. Previously, he has served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Counter-Threat Finance and Sanctions in the State Department's Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs, as well as serving on the State Department's policy planning staff, where he was instrumental in developing Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's economic statecraft agenda. Earlier in his career, Mr. Harrell served on President Obama's 2008 campaign and as a reporter for Congressional Quarterly in Washington, D.C. He's the author of one book, Rwanda's Gamble, Gakaka, and a New Model of Transitional Justice. He is magna cum laude graduate of Princeton University and holds a JD from the Yale Law School. Peter, welcome to this. Next, I'm delighted to introduce Jane Nakano, who is Senior Fellow for Energy Security and Climate Change Program at CSIS. Her research interests include US energy policy, global market and policy developments concerning natural gas, nuclear energy, and critical minerals, and energy security and climate issues in the Asia-Pacific region. She frequently writes and speaks on these issues at domestic and international conferences and to media around the world. She has also testified before Congress on China's competitiveness in energy technology manufacturing and exports, as well as US LNG exports, and before the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission on US-China nuclear energy cooperation. Prior to joining CSIS, Jane worked in the Office of International Affairs in the US Department of Energy, where she covered a host of energy, economic, and political issues in Asia. Jane graduated from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and holds a master's degree from Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Jane, thanks so much for joining us today. And lastly, but not least, Ben Steinberg, Senior Vice President of Venn Strategies. Venn Strategies is focused on supporting critical infrastructure and energy clients. In his capacity at Venn, Ben manages the Battery Materials and Technology Coalition, a group of private entities in the upstream and midstream battery and critical material sectors that are united behind a shared interest in growing a secure North American supply chain. Prior to joining Venn, he spent nearly a decade as a key official at the US Department of Energy, most recently in the Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response, where he was senior advisor working with agency leaders and stakeholders on matters of cyber preparedness, security, and emergency response. He's held several other key roles at DOE, and has acted as a liaison between the Department of Energy and Department of Defense, building energy technology development partnerships for grid security, alternative fuels, batteries, and energy efficiency. Ben received his bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and his master's degree in urban and environmental policy and planning from Tufts University. Ben, thank you so much for agreeing to speak on this panel today. Let me just give a very brief introduction to the publication. The Mosaic approach has come out of a 2-month-long consultation process that we enacted at the Wilson Center, engaging with stakeholders in the critical mineral space. Our purpose was to complement and supplement the work that's been going on through the Biden administration, and in particular through the White House itself, in terms of reaching out to stakeholders in this space to try to resolve many of the vulnerabilities and weaknesses in America's supply chain process, specifically on critical minerals. Over the period of 2 months, we held a number of dialogues where we asked stakeholders from the private sector, from government, and from think tanks to help us to identify the shape of the critical mineral supply chain, the main vulnerabilities in that supply chain, and then most importantly, ideas for resolving those vulnerabilities. It was an extraordinarily informative process. I think all of us learned a great deal, but we ended up, as we often do in these cases, with a rule of three takeaway. First of all, we see three major vulnerabilities in the supply chain. Essentially, first of all, that demand is outstripping supply at an extraordinary rate. And unless something changes very quickly, we will be left without the necessary critical mineral supplies that we need for our competitiveness as a nation, as well as the defense of the nation. That rapid growth in demand is, of course, driven by a number of factors, but most importantly is by the energy transition itself, as we move towards increasing focus on electrification and renewable energy. Secondly, we identified a very significant vulnerability in the level of competition, obviously with regards to China, and I know that a couple of our speakers are going to make reference to that, but also, of course, that there is a headlong struggle right now to try to secure access to critical minerals around the world, including from our allies in Europe, Canada, and other countries. The third set of vulnerabilities were identified with reference to the governance of the critical minerals sector. And American, Canadian, and European firms identified that they felt themselves at a disadvantage relative to Chinese and other competitors with regards for their transparency, disclosure, and ESG requirements. And rather than saying that the standards needed to be lowered, everyone agreed that what we need is in fact a global raising of standards and a unified approach to a regime for ESG. The solutions that we came out with, they're therefore focused on three levels: what the government can do, what the private sector can do, and what can be done not just at the national level, but internationally. And before closing and passing the microphone over to Peter, I'd like to say that at the international level, there was consensus that two things need to happen. The first is what I mentioned already, the development of an international regime to provide harmonized standards for governance, for environmental and social regulation, and in particular for transparency and disclosure. And secondly, that allies are going to be fundamentally important, not just in the extraction of critical minerals from the earth, but just as importantly, in the refining and processing of those critical minerals. It's a short report, only totaling about 25 pages. I urge everybody on this call to download it and take a look at it. But I think it's a wonderful conversation starter, and I'm delighted that we can now engage in this conversation with our panelists. Before I turn it over to Peter, one last thing. Would you please, if you have questions, please tweet at Wilson Center with the hashtag Mosaic Approach, and we will be able to identify your questions, and then we can put them to the panelists when we get to the Q&A. So without further ado, Peter, let me turn to you. I'd love to hear your reactions to the report and perhaps giving us an update on where we are in the critical minerals review process or the supply chains review process at this point in time.
Well, thank you very much, Duncan, for inviting me to be here, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel. I'm sorry I'm doing this on a phone. Anyone who's worked in government knows they don't always make the IT all that easy for those of us working in the White House. So I'm sorry about the visual here of mostly the ceiling, but really a pleasure to be able to be with you. And I really want to thank both you and the Wilson Center and your co-authors, Alexandra and Mary and Eric, for the important and timely report on a Mosaic approach to strengthening U.S. critical minerals supply chains. I've had a chance to review the report. As you noted, it's helpfully digestible to policymakers, and really, I think, but at the same time is really quite comprehensive and insightful, both on the kind of what are the vulnerabilities we face, and you just laid out three of them, but also on some very practical and actionable solutions that I think we are here at the White House in the process of digesting as we carry forward our own work on critical minerals supply chains. As you alluded, Duncan, critical minerals were a key part of President Biden's national supply chain initiative that we launched in February, and we released a Biden administration report on U.S. critical minerals supply chains in June. We're now carrying forward implementation of the set of recommendations we released in June, but we're also very much still in the process of looking for additional ideas and recommendations to ensure that we and our allies successfully secure access to critical minerals. I think that the Wilson Center report drives home a number of key recommendations that complement and help strengthen the approach we are taking as an administration. And so let me talk for a moment about our administration's approach, which I think will draw on and reflect a number of the findings in your report. So first, we've been taking a mineral by mineral approach. Your report focused on 5 or 6 key minerals: lithium, graphite, cobalt, nickel, and rare earths. You also touched on copper a bit, although it was not as central as some of the other minerals in your report. And we also see all of those minerals as essential. And I think the report really helped drive home why we see those minerals as essential. But frankly, the point, Duncan, you just made, we're going to see exponential growth of the demand for all of those minerals, driven largely, though not exclusively, by the clean energy revolution. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the supply chains, and your report brings us home, your supply chains for these minerals are, although there are similarities, there are also differences, right? Nickel, cobalt, for example, comes largely from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Copper, for example, has a much more geographically diversified mining base around the world. So you do have to think about minerals, although there are cross-cutting similarities, there is also a need to think about them as a mineral by mineral approach. Second, and this was a point you just made that I think comes through very strongly in the report, we need to be and are looking at all parts of the mineral supply chain, not just the initial mining. While the initial mining is critically important, the processing and refining of critical minerals is also a major vulnerability. And as we look out across key minerals, we often find that China has a larger share of processing than it has of ore production. So, for example, most cobalt, as I just said, and is reflected in the report, is mined in the DRC. It is mostly refined in China. Actually, if you look at U.S. Minerals production, we actually currently export a fairly significant share of our domestic production of certain key minerals like rare earths, where we do produce some domestically. We export the ores often to China for processing. So I think we have a particular vulnerability as the United States, along with a number of our allies, in the processing of critical minerals. And I think that really came home in your report. Now, third point, which I think also comes through very clearly in your report, is that while we need to focus on expanding production here in the US, as well as in our allies and partners, we have to do so in an environmentally and socially responsible manner. I think particularly here in the US, but also around the world, for too long, mining has had not only negative environmental impacts, but disproportionately negative impacts on disadvantaged communities, Native American tribes, or other indigenous peoples. And I think the reality is, both for moral reasons and for political sustainability reasons, we have to take this legacy head on and make sure that we get buy-in from all stakeholders and make sure we are, in fact, producing minerals in an environmentally and socially responsible manner if we're going to be able to secure our supply chains. Let me highlight just a couple of specific actions that we, as the administration, are taking and have been taking following the release of our report. So first, the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense, along with a couple of other agencies, are working to expand domestic investments in both mining and processing. So, for example, just last month, the Defense Department announced funding for a pilot project with a Pennsylvania company to recover rare earth elements from coal ash. Earlier this year, the Department of Energy announced $19 million in funding to produce rare earths in traditionally fossil fuel producing communities. And both DOE and the Department of Defense are looking at a range of other investments here at home to expand both mining and processing across a suite of critical minerals. We're also working on stockpiling issues. On that front, I'd highlight that just last week, or I guess it was the 7th of the month, so maybe 2 weeks ago now, the Department of Defense added graphite to its national stockpile acquisitions list, recognizing the importance of graphite to our national security as well as our economic sustainability. We've also set up an interagency process to try to develop sustainability standards and to try to get permitting right. One of the things we have heard from industry stakeholders that came through in your report is the need to make sure that there is a timely and regular process to secure permits. Companies, mining companies, you talk to mining companies around the world, they recognize permits won't always come through. Obviously, they want permits, and they recognize they won't always come through. But they do want to understand what the process will look like, how long it will take, and when how long they will have to know it will take before they know whether or not they'll be able to move forward with a new planned facility. And so we're looking at that set of permitting issues. We're also working with partners and allies to expand both production and processing. So the Development Finance Corporation, the U.S. National Development Finance Institution, is standing up a new work stream looking at investments in, now because of the nature of what they do, it's mostly lower income and lower middle income countries, but in both mining and processing facilities across a couple of key critical minerals, particularly for the electric vehicle battery space. So we have sort of a US government financing stream internationally. We're also using some of our international cooperation forums to work on both collectively mapping supply chains, but also making some joint investments. So with both the Trade and Technology Council with Europe and also the Quad, the Asian Quad with Australia, Japan, and India, as well as the US, we have active work streams on critical metals, looking at ways to harmonize some of our investments, make sure that we understand how we can work as allies to close vulnerabilities. A final area of work I want to highlight, one of which was touched on in the report, but I hope as you carry this work forward, you might be able to do some more research on, is around research and development. You highlight in the report the need and the utility of thinking about innovation in the mining sector to make mining more sustainable, cleaner, faster, cheaper, and the like. I think there's also an important part of R&D about figuring out where we can reduce our dependence on certain critical minerals. And you actually touched on this in your report where you noted that 10 years from now, probably each individual EV, electric vehicle battery, will use far less cobalt than it does today. And we have a work stream in the US. You also highlighted, I think correctly, we won't escape our dependency on cobalt, but the kind of intensity of use of cobalt is likely to decline over the next 10 years. And so we have a work stream going on in the US government to think through where are the areas we can use R&D funding, not this year, not next year, but over a 5 to 10 year time horizon to actually reduce dependency on a couple of these critical minerals. Lithium's one we're not going to succeed. There's no battery expert we have talked to that thinks you're going to get out of need for lithium. Similarly, copper. There's no way you're going to manage to engineer away a dependency on copper as we shift to green energy technologies. But some of these other ones, kind of making sure that we are able to reduce our dependency, reduce demand, is another important piece of the puzzle. In closing, I just want to say thanks again for the report. And in particular, I think looking at it from US government perspective, I value a number of areas that we have not we are only in the early days of working on. I think you highlighted, for example, workforce development issues, both job training and sort of things we can do to make the jobs attractive to people, mining jobs and processing jobs attractive to people entering their careers. I think that's a very important set of recommendations that we're going to digest more fully, as well as sort of some of your ideas around fixed price contracts to show sustainable demand for creating new mines and new processing facilities here in the US, as well as international ESG standards, something that I think is of interest for us. We'd be interested in hearing from you more fully how we can actually go out and build some global ESG standards for critical minerals. So I just want to say thanks again for the report and the opportunity to speak with you here today.
Peter, thank you so much for those obviously very insightful comments, but also for your support in being here today. It means a great deal to us. And just in response to your last comments, certainly we will be carrying this work forward. We have plans to engage with international partners like the World Economic Forum and Transparency International to look at the ESG standards and disclosure standards. That's something that I think that is right in the bailiwick of the Wilson Center to look at that kind of international work that could be carried out. But on the workforce development aspect, we've got a body of work that looks at workforce development in different sectors in North America. And I think that that's probably something that we will carry forward to look at how we can work with Canada and Mexico to try to come up with those kind of responses. Because as we say time and time again, the United States may be able to do it alone, but it's going to be a lot easier if it goes along with its partners. So thank you so much. And yes, we will continue to be in touch with your office about moving this work forward. I'm now going to turn to Jane. Let me just point out before Jane speaks that Jane was one of the members of this group that participated in the dialogues. Jane was there for all of the sessions and was a very valued participant. So Jane, thank you very much for your commitment to this project. And, I'm always very, very grateful for cooperation that extends between think tanks. I have a past affiliation with CSAS myself and have a great deal of respect for them. So it was great to have you on board, but let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Duncan, for having me, certainly at this launch on this very timely and important report, but then also having me at the series of workshops. I learned a great deal from all the other participants. So this, the security of critical mineral supply chains is an issue that is really at the nexus of this climate challenge, but then also geopolitical challenge. And I think that's one of the key things that the report really wants, is stressing to particularly, the government policymakers. And, as Peter has already noted, this, energy transition is, driving the growth of demand for critical minerals, and they're really important for clean energy technologies. So, naturally, securing these minerals matters. I mean, really affects both the pace and scope of this climate mitigation measures, particularly, it's a top priority for this administration. I'm very happy to see greater focus on this, as well as more of a security implications of critical minerals supply chain matter under this administration. But I think I wanted to focus a little more on the geopolitics side today in the next 7 or 8 minutes. In many ways, I guess, this energy transition have us, much, less, I guess, preoccupied more or less about what's happening in the Middle East, for example, or what's happening with the security of sea lanes around the world. And perhaps at the, individual or more of a micro level, one could say that an EV ownership could probably free us from this, weekly stress over gasoline prices. But as a society, we're starting to realize that this, this sort of transition comes with a new set or a different set of geopolitical questions that we really need to address, and some are more, challenges in a very clear manner. I think today we're much more aware of how dependent we as a nation has become on these the minerals that are produced and processed elsewhere. And also, this comes, in a time when there is a growing tension between the United States and China, which really is the dominant supplier of many of these minerals. But, so how serious are these challenges? And, why do we, why do they warrant effective U.S. actions? Just the key things, much more of a China-focused stuff to stress are that one, the U.S., well, I've already sort of mentioned, but it's heavily dependent on China for these minerals. It's not that the United States does not have resources or expertise or tradition of mining. It's just, and in fact, until the late 1980s, the United States, for example, in terms of the rare earth, was one of the global leaders in rare earth. But much of the U.S. extraction and production of many minerals, including rare earth, has gone abroad in the subsequent decades. mean, there's no single reason, but I still have to, mention that I think it has a lot to do with how China developed the industrial policy and really, several decades ago, but then really tirelessly implemented them, the policies and plans to execute this industrial strategy. For example, as early as 1980s, Chinese are spending a lot of money on R&D, on things like rare earth related mining, smelting, and also trying to figure out more higher value applications of these resources. Also, I guess, China tried the export restrictions starting in late 1990s until the World Trade Organization basically ruled against or sided with the United States, EU, and Japan that the Chinese practices were violating WTO rules. But this, export restrictions continued until mid 2010s. There also has been production quotas since 2006. And so there are very, many steps that China has implemented to really, strengthen its position. By late 2010s, Chinese supplies came to account for roughly 80% of US imports of rare earth compounds and metals. The second reason why we really should care more than ever about this from a geopolitical perspective is that even China is becoming more import dependent. So Chinese production of rare earth end products have been growing quite a bit, roughly like about 70% between 2005 and 2015. And during roughly the same period of time, the same decade, pretty much, the Chinese rare earth consumption grew at an annual average of 7.5%. So China is needing more of these minerals they're producing as they're now starting to capture the higher value end of the value chains. But what's also interesting is that China is really then now trying to more actively address this sort of growing security concern associated with its critical mineral supply chains. About a decade ago, they came up with this a strategy to better sort of monitor what's happening in the global markets. But then also much more recently, like in October 2020, Chinese passed this export control law to restrict exports of controlled items to basically protect the Chinese interest in security. What's interesting is that as far as I'm aware of, there's no clear or there's no elaboration or really clarity to date as to exactly what the whole comprehensive list of what goes under this export control law. But I think rare earth minerals are among the strong suspects. But then also in early this year, I think in January, the China also introduced legislation to reinforce the protection of its rare earth resources to really to make sure, and by strengthening the approval process for mining and processing and also rare earth related trades. And what was really fascinating about this legislation, or at least the way that the Chinese covered this, was that in People's Daily, or I'm sorry, China Daily, it's a state-run newspaper, they said how the China considers rare earth elements to be the prized resources with irreplaceable significance for the upgrade of traditional industries and the development of emerging industries. So clearly it's not just they're trying to replicate what the West has been doing with these resources, but it's really to compete. And that sort of takes me to the third and last reason as to why we really need to address this vulnerability or the security concern, is that clean energy technology itself has become a new frontier of this geo-economic competition between the United States and China. Actually, I'd probably say it's not just between the two countries. I think between China and the West, but then also among some of the Western countries. But after several decades of executing, these industrial, policies, China really has become much more of a, producer, but then also exporter of these clean energy technology components, like, the solar, wind, power components, but then also, things like lithium-ion batteries for EVs. And for example, in the solar PV sector, China accounts for over 90% of solar wafer manufacturing capacity today, while Chinese companies, regardless of where their factories are located, own roughly 2/3 of the polysilicon manufacturing capacity in the world. In the EV battery sector, China accounts for a majority of processing capacity for key EV battery components. And also almost 80% of the battery cell manufacturing capacity in the world. So, since I'm an energy person as opposed to, and really, anything else, but, I definitely wanted to note that, this energy storage technologies are basically dual use, so it's important for the low carbon economy, but then there are also important military applications, right? So, high capacity batteries and EVs can support military operations by providing electricity for communication links to the battlefield, for example. So what these countries, not just China, not just the US, and perhaps some of the other OECD economies try to do in terms of, innovation, support hugely matters to our national security as well. So, quickly, I guess, in the end, I mean, we're starting to see, though, that, there are greater investments into things like, battery manufacturing in the United States. But, I was looking at one of the benchmark mineral intelligence data the other day, and I think they said that there are about 200 megafactories in the pipeline for these EV battery manufacturing today, but roughly 3/4 of those are in China, only 21 are in Europe, and 11 in North America, not even just the United States. So, so it's not just that China has a commanding position on these supply chains of critical minerals, or it's not just that the US is heavily, import dependent for these minerals. I think, I think China is definitely starting to realize that there is this geopolitical leverage that could be gained. And just, lastly, I think a lot of folks, certainly on this panel, are aware, but, during one of the heights of the US-China trade wars in 2019, Chinese President Xi Jinping, together with Vice Premier Liu He, they both visited a rare earth processing facility in Jiangxi province, which is one of the huge rare earth hubs in China. And that was largely really understood to be China sort of giving a warning signal or more of a reminder to the United States that, US is highly dependent on Chinese rare earth. So, and it's not to say that they will definitely, use this leverage. I'm just saying that there are a lot of geopolitical concerns and things that also come with the energy transition, and that shouldn't be an excuse for not pursuing clean energy transition. But I think there is now a new set of things that we really need to address, and so clearly the stake is high, and I think we're starting to run out of time. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jane. That was splendid. And I think your last comment is absolutely right. We're starting to run out of time. As we discussed earlier on today, it's amazing that, some people have been aware of this issue for a long time, and partly because of the nature of our political system, partly because there were so many other things going on, we haven't acted on it so far. And, it's always easy to criticize government for not acting, but of course they have had their hands full with other things. But regardless of what has happened in the past, right now, we're reaching that critical moment in terms of moving forward. I'm going to come back to you with a couple of questions at the end, Jane, but I want to move on to Ben. Ben, thank you very much for agreeing to participate. And I'd love it if you could make some comments from an industry perspective, but I know that you have thoughts beyond that because, of course, from your time in government, you have a keen interest in policy. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Duncan, and thank you to the Wilson Center for the invitation. Peter and Jane, I really appreciated your remarks. I hope mine are not too duplicative, although I think we're all focusing on the right issues and ideas. So first off, I thought Duncan, the report was phenomenal. It's a great starter piece for those who are unfamiliar with this space and really want to get up to speed quickly on some of the main issues we really need to focus on in the critical minerals policy arena. So hats off to your team and to the group that put it together. I'm very heartened to see the federal government with all the coordination, Peter, that the White House is doing, and DOE and DOD and Commerce and State around policies for critical minerals. This is, to me, a really important shift in focus around industrial and manufacturing policy. Importantly, there has actually been a lot of continuity from the Trump administration into the Biden administration on critical minerals and industrial policy. And this is really the consistency and longer term approach that helps the private sector enter into markets and stay there. There's really no better emblem of this than the president's executive order on America's supply chains that Peter talked really well about. And it's been impressive to see the intention and attention and the work being put in. And a quick little vignette here is I called the State Department to have a meeting with a client of mine on a Canadian mining issue, and they brought some federal partners to the table, and we got there and it was 50 people on a Zoom from 11 different agencies. So you get a really good sense. I have never seen coordination on this front like this. So for those listening, you really should have confidence that the government is leaning in on this and cares and is trying to problem solve. And equally so, beyond the government, I'm excited to see how the private sector is responding. If you were at Novi, Michigan for the battery conference a month ago, you could see the excitement at the expo there. Thousands of people gathering to talk about batteries and critical minerals. I think there are headwinds at a national level and a private sector level about the idea of mining at home, the idea about working with partners abroad to mine and bring things into the US and process. I think investments are starting to really come here. And if you had asked me when I got into this 2 years ago, whether that was going to happen, I would have given you a maybe to maybe a no. And now I've changed my mind. I really do think that things are shifting. The coalition I work with is the Battery Materials and Technology Coalition. And it's an example of how the private sector is working with government on trying to develop meaningful projects. We worked really hard in the last year with folks in the House and the Senate, and we're able to get $6 billion passed in the Senate bipartisan infrastructure package for material processing and battery component manufacturing for the development of factories and human capital and equipment needed to really do this. And so that money is slated to go to Department of Energy, fingers crossed that it passes in the House and is signed by the president. But that would be a huge boon for the industry in critical areas of supply chain development. And just kind of making comments about the supply chain itself, Jane talked a lot about what China is doing. This really is a simple numbers game. We as Americans want more stuff, need more stuff to build and live in an electrified and digital economy. And because of this, there's a tidal wave of demand coming. Duncan, you touched on this. It's very well laid out in the report. We need batteries, for instance, to power our cars, to store energy on the grid, to keep our computers and cell phones going. And, you know, as we've all talked about, the minerals that we use are coming from abroad. And so, yes, there are huge opportunities for the US to work with allies to develop the partnerships and to import this stuff. But really, we're in a pretty serious race here, and we're woefully behind. I think there's a recognition, and now we're really getting to work to solve those things. And we can use what the rest of the world is doing as a model. We can look at China and look at how they've utilized and built out their chemical manufacturing sector. That's what they spent their time doing in the last 30, 40 years. We can look how they systematically went out and acquired or partnered with countries and companies in Africa and Australia and South America and now Europe to mine and manufacture these products. And we can take note from them how they, as Jane was talking about, how they're actually utilizing this stuff to build industry and jobs at home, they put electric vehicle batteries into buses now, and they kind of into their own economy. So they have this closed loop thing going on. So what do we think is going to happen with what they're doing, what others are doing around the globe is prices will go up. There will be bottlenecks. There will be conflicts. And we already are seeing that in the semiconductor space, in the solar industry as well. Like just today, right? We're having issues importing because the Chinese are potentially using forced labor in the solar panel arena, in the solar cell manufacturing. So you see this foreign dominance in a sector like critical minerals really disrupting the US. So it has become an economic and national security imperative. That's why you have folks like Peter working on this quite intensively. And we really don't have a choice but to enter this market, but not to enter it as China and to try to dominate in that way and have low cost products. It's to do it in I don't know if you call it a better way, but in a way where we're focusing on innovation, on sustainability, on efficiency, on safety, and can distinguish ourselves from others in this space and work with others also to up their game and to learn from them. I know the Europeans, the Canadians, the Australians have been focused on this a little bit and have already developed some really important key lessons learned and processes, and we should be working with them on that. But we can do this. We can build more advanced manufacturing equipment and processes, more advanced products to utilize the critical minerals and do it in a safer, more sustainable way. And one that is co-located next to our manufacturing base. So I think we have the opportunity to do this. We're sitting on deposits of lithium. We're only exploiting a small percent of what we actually have in this country. We're sitting on nickel. We have deposits of cobalt, manganese, graphite, copper, that really we have the opportunity to develop and grow those resources. We have the most advanced oil and gas and chemicals industry in the world, and we have a formidable transportation industry and a resurgence overall in manufacturing in the country that could be the engine of this work. So just a couple observations for policymakers, for the private sector. I really think the extractive sector has largely been vilified in the US, the mining and extraction sector. It's historically not been associated with the clean energy economy, and times have changed. Our way of life has changed, and we really do need the sustained national dialogue about the importance of mining and education on how clean energy products are made here and abroad, because we can do it better. Couple things about the dialogue. It's really an apolitical issue. It should be depoliticized as much as humanly possible between Republicans and Democrats. And it needs to go from the national level, from the president to a governor to a county executive. A lot of the mining and extractive issues, especially, but even when you're building a manufacturing plant in someone's backyard, is a county and a local issue. And I think there could be some connective tissue for the country where you're saying the same things from president down to county exec. And we need to sustain the dialogue for a long time. It needs to be part of our everyday life that we do this here because we need to, and it's important, and we can do it in the best way possible. And then I will just hammer home the point on processing, because again, to Peter's point, to Duncan's, to Jane's, if you don't process the materials and really create the high value material here, we could end up having a resurgence in mining, but then get cut off in the supply chain development up to high value products by having to ship stuff abroad to bring it back. It's very inefficient. It's not good for the environment. And so having a piece of every part of the supply chain where you're using the equipment or the materials is really, really important. And it's something that I think the US could do in a lot shorter order than even in the mining sector based on timescales. So really appreciate the opportunity to talk and looking forward to having a dialogue.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you to all of our panelists. We've got about 10 minutes left. I will remind the audience that if they have a question, please send it via Twitter to @WilsonCenter with the hashtag Mosaic Approach. We've had a few questions come in already, which I'm going to turn to right now. But I would like to just build on something that Ben was just saying. Ben, I mean, your point about the importance of the mining sector is one of the things that I have to say I was not fully aware of because it wasn't part of my day-to-day discourse. But understanding that so many of the things that we use on a daily basis depend upon minerals being extracted from the earth, and beginning to think about it, the laptop computer that I'm using right now would not function without the mining sector. And the fact is that, most people, myself included until recently, looked at the mining industry as being something from the 19th century, but it's fundamentally essential to the 21st century economy and beyond. And so it's sort of squaring the circle there, understanding that minerals are critically important to the geopolitical goals of the United States, to the geoeconomic goals of the United States, and of course, to the energy transition itself, which is ultimately about securing the future of the planet and global population. Peter, I wonder if I can turn to you first of all with a question that has come in, which is actually about a whole of government approach. Ben earlier on talked about the fact that he was on this call and he had 50 different agencies of the US government coming together. It's an extraordinary observation there. But the question we have here actually gives a different perspective, which is to say that we need more of a whole government approach so that national security interests and climate change concerns are taken into consideration to ensure the domestic production of critical minerals like lithium chemicals. And it's basically making a point here that unless we do this, then as we've seen all too often in the United States, important projects are going to be either held up or not ever be completed because of protests from civil society groups, NGOs, local communities, etc. And it was an issue that came up time and time again in our discussions in the critical minerals dialogues, and in particular one graphic that's in the report which shows that the lead time for a mining project is significant anyway. But the fact is that here in the United States, it takes between 7 and 10 years to secure a permit for a mining project on average, whereas in Canada and Australia that have similarly demanding environmental protections, it only takes about 2 years to get a mining permit. Those are the kind of things that are really seen as being challenges from the industry. And I wonder, Peter, if you can talk about how we get that geopolitical, energy transition, climate change perspective into the process.
So I very much appreciate the question. It's certainly something we are quite focused on. I mean, so we have actually kind of coming out of the report we issued in June, we have stood up an ongoing interagency critical minerals working group to pull together exactly that across agency perspective, so that the folks, who have responsibility for permitting, and they have a very important role to play, understand the kind of national security and climate policy objectives that are also at play. But similar to the national security folks and the climate folks, understand the real issues that come up around water pollution and land pollution and impacts on communities. So we have stood up this internal, kind of really quite broad interagency working group to kind of try to do exactly that. Actually, it's interesting hearing the point that just came up about the need to coordinate as well with state and local governments. And that's obviously a hugely important piece of this as well, because as you guys know, it's not just a federal permitting decision. I mean, there is often an EPA angle, or certainly if you're doing this on federal lands, you have a U.S. Department of Agriculture or Department of Interior, permit that has to be issued. But there are also often, state and county permits, and that's probably an area that we should, candidly be giving some more thought to, engagement with the state and local side. The other thing, and I've said this directly to some of the mining companies that I have been meeting with, there are a number of things we can and are working to do to try to provide some greater, certainty on the timeframes within the U.S. government. But I also think the mining companies really have to take to heart a commitment to going out and consulting with some of the local stakeholders. Part of the reason for that difference between the US, Canada, and Australia, it isn't just sort of federal or even state permitting decisions. It's also, we have a highly litigious society, and you do see a lot of these decisions challenged in court, as is the right of Americans to do. And I actually think there's also a piece of this that is about getting the companies, along with the federal government, to start early and often with some of the stakeholder consultations. And that can, maybe add 6 months or a year up front, but it can then save 3 or 4 years in litigation if that actually gets kind of everybody to yes by addressing folks' concerns early. So that's another piece of the puzzle that we've been giving some thought to.
Thank you, Peter. I have a question now from an audience member. It says, how do you expect Europe's carbon border adjustment mechanism to affect EU-China and EU-US critical minerals trade and coordination efforts? I hate to be on the spot, Jane, but I don't know if you have a response to that. I'm sure it's an issue that you've been following.
Yeah, no, so thank you for the question. So the implications for the EU-China as well as
EU-China and EU-US critical minerals trade and coordination.
Got it. Okay. So I think EU-China. I mean, there's the investment agreement. That's that, unless I missed any major development in the past couple months, I think it's yet to be completely finalized over some of the sort of difference of view on some geopolitical questions. But as far as that's the investment piece. But as far as the carbon border adjustment, no, it's a fascinating question. I don't, if I'm not mistaken, so the EU CBAM, if I'm not mistaken, does not include minerals part of it. Please correct me, Peter, if I got this wrong. But I think they're looking at much more about end use sectors, like steelmaking, aluminum. So for now, I think maybe some of the implications are not immediately obvious. And then quickly before, maybe I turn to Peter, the other thing about, so the other piece was, sorry, the US-China.
Yeah, EU-China and EU-US.
EU-US, I'm sorry, yes. The EU-US, I think in general, I think the European CBAM, again, my understanding is that it does not include the minerals, upstream. So I don't know exactly what sort of immediate implications that may have.
Okay. Thank you, Jane. Peter, do you have anything to add on to that?
Not really, and I wouldn't want to speak for the European Union, but I share, I mean, our understanding is, as Jane says, that the EU's, at least in the first instance, their CBAM is kind of, sectoral focused and probably going to start with things like cement and maybe steel. So I think it may be over time, I could see it having some impacts as it gets rolled out more broadly, but they seem to be, again, I don't want to speak for them, but our understanding is they seem to be, starting with a couple of discrete products and sectors.
Thanks a lot, Peter. We have time for one last question, which come in from an audience member. What are the biggest challenges for processing and refining facilities in the US, Ben? I'm going to turn to you because you mentioned this about the need to expand on refining and processing capacity for critical minerals. What is it that we're lacking? Is it investment? Is it the permitting? What is it that's holding us back?
I think folks have been afraid to. I think a lot of the American companies have been camped out in China doing the processing, or in Europe. I think there is a fear of not being able to turn a profit, and that we're behind. And so you got to put in a lot of these capital investments. And I don't necessarily think that's prohibitive. I think things are turning around. So there is the like, can we produce a profit in the US? And then is there enough demand to turn our product and sell it into the US? So I think there has been a lot of both of those sides of the coin conversation, which has limited the activity here, although I think it's changing.
Thank you, Ben. All that remains is for me to thank our panelists once again. Jane, Ben, Peter, thank you very much for your support. Thank you for being here and answering these questions and sharing your insights. I do want to add one last thing before we close, which is that our work on critical minerals continues. And one of the exciting projects that we've got coming up is to look at how the North American nations can collaborate increasingly to create not just a North American manufacturing platform, but a North American extractive industries platform. There's enormous potential there. All three countries are mining nations. All three countries have proud traditions, great deal of expertise and investment. And so understanding how the region of North America can satisfy some of these supply chains, vulnerabilities and demands will be part of our work moving forward. Thank you, everybody who's been here today. Thank you to our audience and joining us, and thanks for those of you who sent in questions. Please stay tuned to the Wilson Center, and please download the report, A Mosaic Approach. Good afternoon, everyone.